I completely removed dice from my miniature skirmish game and replaced them with cards. Now, I know there are other games out there that have done the same, but I took it a step further and replaced everything else as well, including the ruler. So now, all you need to play is a regular pack of playing cards. And miniatures, of course, or else it wouldn't be a miniature skirmish game. Anyway, let's take a look at the latest version of my game, Spire Seas. For those of you who are new to the channel, Spire Seas is a 28mm miniature skirmish game, which takes place in the flooded ruins of a post-apocalyptic city. Players take control of a crew of scavengers, navigating through the narrow passages between buildings on one of these scav ships, each attempting to get their hands on that rusty old salvage from the ancient world. Now, over the past 6 months or so, I've spent most of my time and energy on learning how to design and paint my own miniatures and terrain for use in this game. But now that I have a full set of STLs ready to paint and play with, which you can download for yourself on myminifactory.com, it's time to return to game design. So, why playing cards? Well, from the beginning, this game was designed to be relatively accessible. I wanted new players to be able to print what they needed at home, set up a game on whatever table they had available, and get a few quick games in. That's why I originally designed my game around a 2d6 system. These are just things that pretty much everyone has at home, or can at least salvage from an old copy of Monopoly. However, I ran into a problem fairly early on. Since this game was all about boats, I really wanted to include some sort of system for interacting with the wind. It made sense to me to use the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, to represent the 4 sides of the board. But it was really hard to get those numbers to be equally random if I was using a 6-sided die. So, even early on in the process, I started using cards. Specifically, each suit could represent one of the cardinal directions, and therefore one of the edges of the board. Plus, everyone I know, even if they're not an avid tabletop gamer, already has a deck of cards lying around their house, or at least can go get one fairly quickly and cheaply at their local dollar store or even gas station. And once they were part of the game, I could start using them for other things, like activation. But then, things got messy. Pretty much everyone who tried my game had the same initial reaction. Wait, you use cards and dice? How does that even work? Which is a fair response. I mean, for me, it didn't really matter, but I was the designer. I could see the process in my brain and how I got there. But for people coming into a new game in a maybe new genre, it was just kind of a lot to take in. So I knew that one of them had to go. And it was admittedly really difficult to choose. Either way, I felt like I would be missing out on something that I really enjoyed about my game. Then, I got a sudden jolt of inspiration. While working on some miniatures, desperately avoiding thinking about all of the problems with my game, I came across an episode of Rule of Carnage, which addressed this very issue. If you're not aware, Rule of Carnage is a podcast and YouTube channel dedicated to miniature game design, specifically, by the creators of the fantastic Gaslands, which is one of my favorite miniature wargames. If, like me, you are in the middle of designing your own game or are just really interested in the nitty-gritty details of game design, then I highly recommend checking it out. Anyway, after watching their video on cards in wargames, I started thinking about them in a whole new way. Not only as a really interesting randomizer, but also as a way to keep track of information on the table, and even as a measuring device. Suddenly, I had more ideas than I knew what to do with. I was thinking of ways to use cards for everything. I even spent a few hours trying to figure out how to make the cards into the terrain itself, which didn't really work out well, but who knows, I might get it eventually. But eventually, for the core rules of the game, I boiled it down into 4 basic mechanics. But before we get into the details, let me remind you that this is a very early version of the game, and all of this is still being worked on. So if you have any feedback on how these mechanics work or what you think about them, please let me know down in the comments. And if you're watching from some future place, then remember that these rules may have already been changed, so double check the current version. But for now, cards determine wind direction and strength. At the beginning of the round, players flip cards to determine which way and how hard the wind is blowing. Each suit correlates to a certain direction, and the number on the card is how strong it is. At the end of the round, crews have to successfully sail their ship or risk being dashed against an ancient ruin. Cards also determine model activation. Each player starts the crew phase with a hand of 5 cards, which they can play in order to activate a model. The highest number goes first. But be careful. In order to react to another player's actions, you'll have to play another card that's higher than the one used to activate it. So, if all you have are lower numbers, then you might not be able to do things later in the round. Then, of course, there are the actions themselves. For most actions that a model takes, players will flip a card to determine the success. They take the number on the card and add that to the stat bonus for the relevant stat. But keep in mind that each stat is also associated with a different suit. So if you get the matching suit for your action, in this case diamonds for technical skills, then you get a little bonus as well. Most actions are considered a success if the total is higher than 10. Combat does work a little bit differently, requiring players to sometimes flip higher than their opponent's total instead. And of course, the ace is critical, mostly just so that I can say, "The ace of spades," anytime I critical hit an opponent. And finally, cards are used for measurement. I will say this is the mechanic I'm most excited about, and I may have borrowed heavily from that Rule of Carnage episode, but I did put my own spin on it. You may not know this, but playing cards have an international standard size. They are 3.5 inches long and 2.5 inches wide. Even here in Japan, where we use centimeters, these cards are the same measurement as back in the US. There are, of course, some variations, I'm sure, and I know bridge cards and some casino cards are a slightly different size, but for the most part, if you go down to your local dollar store, your cards will be the same as mine. So, by using this mechanic, I not only get to set aside my old ruler, but I also get to ignore the problem of metric versus inches, which has been a challenge for me. I specifically brought this wooden ruler over from America back here to Japan because it had both on it. And now I guess I don't need it. As if that wasn't good enough, there's actually another benefit to using cards as a measurement device. You see, we have our two measurements, our length and our width. But if we use 2 cards, we actually get a secret third measurement, which is the difference between the two. Doing the fairly simple math, you can tell that this little gap here is exactly 1 inch wide. And yes, it does require you to have 2 cards that you're not actively using in the game, but if you buy a pack, you should already have exactly that. Now, I can already tell some people are going to say this is not really a good length for a tabletop wargame. I mean, it is only 3.5 inches after all. However, with a game like Spire Seas and its limited terrain, most of the models are never going to be moving more than 3 or 6 inches at a time anyway. That means the only thing it really affects is the ranged units. And for those, I just gave them long range. Now, weapons like a crossbow or a ballista can simply fire at anything within line of sight, which on this size table I think is actually more realistic than 12 inches or 10 inches or whatever random number you decide to give them. And that's pretty much it. There are, of course, other rules that involve list building and things that don't really involve cards, but I won't go over those here, or else this would easily turn into an hour-long video. But you can, of course, take a look at the full rules yourself by going over to my website or Discord channel and downloading the free PDF. All that I ask is that you leave me some feedback about how to improve, either there or here in the comments below. Which brings me to the next step. Up to now, I've been working on this game more or less by myself, and that can only get me so far. Before I add any new mechanics or options, I need to make sure that this system is already working, and that means I need feedback from players like you. So whether you enjoyed the game and had a great time, or found something really weird and uncomfortable like not rolling dice, just let me know. Going forward, I hope to be updating the rules every month or so, and once the core mechanics are settled, I'll be adding in new things like campaigns and factions. Plus, there are still a lot of cool card mechanics that I could add in, things like reshuffling, discarding, and cheating in cards. But, as usual, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, for the next few months, while this new rule system gets settled in, I'm going to be going back to making some models. I really want to make sure that everything you see in the rules can be accurately represented on the table, and that means modeling some new weapons for the models and the scav cutter. So keep an eye here on the channel if you'd like to see that. Plus, if you'd like to learn a little more about the lore of the world that I'm creating, you can check that out over here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.